So now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, who is going to be Gillean Richmond. Gillean is a member of the Church of Scotland, which is a denomination within the Reformed tradition of the Christian faith. And a little bit about Gillean. She's originally from Barrhead, a town in the south side of Glasgow, and she trained as a dentist. She took a break from dentistry when her children were small, but didn't go back to dentistry, but followed a call from God to become a minister for the Church of Scotland in 2017, when living in North Wales. She was ordained in September 2022, and she currently lives and works in Troon on the west coast of Ayrshire, where she serves the people of two churches in the town. So thank you for coming, Gillean, and we look forward to what you have to share with us this evening.
Thank you very much, Frances. As Frances said, I am part of the Church of Scotland, and Frances alluded to earlier, we have denominational differences, so I can only speak from my denomination. And the topic for tonight is really interesting when we look at it from the Christian perspective. And of course, like so many of our world religions, there are huge variations within Christianity as to the role women can take in leadership. For much of the history of the Church of Scotland, women's roles have been imagined as being supportive ones, supporting the men who led worship in the churches, supporting the family as they grew within their faith, and supporting neighbours and their communities as they tried to live out their shared values. It's fair to say, however, that there are some feisty women in the past in the Church of Scotland. I like to think there is some truth in the almost legendary story of Jenny Geddes. She is said to have sparked riots in Edinburgh in the 1630s when she threw a stool at the minister of her church during a service because she objected to the new worship book he was trying to introduce. These riots ultimately led to religious wars between England and Scotland, and some even say they led to the English Civil War, but that's for a different discussion altogether. I grew up in the Church of Scotland. As a child, I saw women serve as elders, reading our scriptures in public, visiting people in need, looking after the fabric and structure of our buildings, teaching and making decisions about how our church should run. When I was a teenager, a trainee minister who was a woman came to work in my home church, and so I saw her preach and officiate at significant ceremonies and events. Women, as far as I could see then, had important roles in the life and leadership of the church. I may, however, have attended a somewhat unusual church, as this is not the experience of many of my friends and colleagues. And it's also fair to say that I didn't really experience sexism in my professional career until I started training to be a minister. The women who I witnessed leading my church were standing in the shadows and walking in the footsteps of the women that we read of in our ancient scriptures. Christianity has a Bible which consists of two books, one we called the Old Testament, which is also known as the Hebrew Bible, which means we share some of our faith heritage with the Jewish tradition. And we also have a New Testament, which is about Jesus, a man Christians believe was both divine and human, and whose teachings and example we try to follow. Jesus became known as the Christ after he died, and it gives Christians their name. And whilst it's fair to say that these books were overwhelmingly written by men and feature mostly male characters, women are there, being rebellious, controversial, faithful, and encouraging people as they lead them to know and experience the divine. In the stories about Jesus, we find women were afforded unusual freedom for the times, as they were amongst the travelling band who followed, listened to, and challenged Jesus in his itinerant ministry. Independent wealth for women would have been really unusual 2,000 years ago when Jesus was said to have been alive, yet we read of such women who actually pay for Jesus' work. Women such as Dorcas, Lydia, and Priscilla helped to build up and lead the first generations of Christians, and they developed their own unique roles. They were businesswomen, teachers, spiritual leaders, students, and all were specifically tasked with spreading the word about Jesus to all they met. We read of Mary and Martha, who challenged the status quo by having an argument about who should do all the domestic chores and instead took part in discussions about faith. There's an unnamed woman who confronts Jesus at the well, who challenges gender and cultural norms. Jesus' mother speaks a hugely powerful piece of political rhetoric in a conversation between two pregnant women as they consider the future of the world for their unborn children. And there's also an incident where an unnamed woman anoints Jesus' head with oil. It's a ceremonial blessing is given, which would suggest she held a position of authority within her community. In an era where women and girls were denied an education, Jesus met women who would debate and discuss contemporary ideas and who would start the conversation rather than waiting to be invited to speak. Many of the named and unnamed women in the New Testament were feisty, they were determined and independent and openly questioned their roles in society. We may have to look beyond the surface readings to see them clearly, but they're certainly there, leading their people by example and sometimes giving them a wee prod and a prompt to make them think differently about what leadership actually looks like. When we look to women in the Old Testament, we find them inhabiting roles as diverse as judge, prophet, warrior, worship leader, and queen. Miriam, who is named as a prophet, identifies that the people need a focus for their emotions and picks up a tambourine to lead them in songs and worship. Some passages name her as the one who led the nation to safety and out of slavery. There's both a prophet and a judge. There's a woman called Deborah who would sit under a tree and the people of her tribe would come to her for advice and wisdom. She was also a warrior who led a successful campaign against oppressors. In the story, we read that the male captain of the army refuses to go into battle without Deborah, and so she retorts that the victory must therefore belong to a woman rather than a fearful man. My favourite female character of the whole Bible is in this story. After the enemy are defeated, their leader runs away and is met by a woman called Jael. Jael gives him milk and sympathises with his terrible plight. Then she waits for him to fall asleep before driving a tent peg into his head through his temple. Jael may have only been a woman in the eyes of the author, but she saves the people, and hymns are written about her and Deborah for their fierce, capable leadership when their male counterparts failed. When reform of ancient corrupt religious systems is needed, it's to the prophet Huldah, a woman that the leaders turn, as her wisdom and insight into how to achieve this is valued. Queen Esther, also in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, starts off as a kind of compliant and pliable young woman who matures into a leader who ultimately saves her people through her quick wit and skills of rhetoric, ensuring that the Jewish people are freed from oppression. Fortunately, my work in Troon doesn't require me to fight in battle or use tent pegs inappropriately, but as an ordained minister, my leadership roles are quite varied. I'm responsible for the content of worship that happens in church on a Sunday morning, and that means coordinating with various teams of volunteers and paid staff. I'm also expected to moderate meetings, to teach, to lead small groups as they explore spirituality, and to come up with programmes of outreach to enhance our local community. We've seen significant change in the Church of Scotland since Jenny Geddes threw her stool at a minister in objection to how he was leading worship. Currently, around 1/3 of the ministers in the church are women. In our structure, we have no one individual in charge, but we have some post holders who are quite high profile. And so you might encounter our current moderator, the Reverend Sally Foster Fulton, and our principal clerk, the Reverend Fiona Smith. There are therefore effectively no roles within the structure of my church that can't be undertaken by women. Since 1966, women have been allowed to take on the role of elder. From 1968, we could be ordained as ministers, and for 135 years could serve as deaconesses, or as we now call them, deacons. And deacons undertake the work of teaching as well as serving and leading their local communities. Now we have women leading and representing the church in many diverse positions. We have women who are chaplains to prisons, to hospitals and the armed forces. We have women who are ministers in large and small churches, clerks to presbyteries and kirk sessions, as readers and ordained local ministers. In fact, it's highly likely that in my working life as a minister, we may well see more women than men working as ministers, but we're certainly doing our best to balance those numbers out. That doesn't mean that we don't experience resistance for being female, but the rich heritage of feisty, confident and capable women who led communities of faith in my ancient scriptures encourages me to know that, along with Jenny Geddes and her stool throwing, that I'm hopefully in quite good company.